my mother asked me to sign something. Just a small form, she said, something to help settle your grandfather's affairs quickly. She was smiling when she handed it to me. Her lipstick perfect. Her tone gentle. Her eyes, distant. Like she'd already spent the money. I didn't sign it. Instead, I took the envelope home, poured a glass of wine, and read every word. All 6 pages. Twice. That's when I realized what they were trying to do. And that's when everything I thought I understood about family fell apart. I'm Eliza. I'm 33 years old. And until last winter, I genuinely believed I was the lucky one. Not in the traditional sense. I didn't grow up in a warm household or have the kind of mother who packed lunches or remembered to call on my birthday. But I had one person who made everything else bearable. My grandfather, Henry. He was the only one who ever looked at me like I mattered, not as an accessory to my parents' image, not as a backup plan for my siblings, but as a person in my own right. He's the reason I survived this family. And now, months after his death, I found out he was still trying to protect me. Even from beyond the grave. The will had been rewritten. Quietly. Legally. Everything he owned, the farmhouse, the land, the stocks, even the trust fund, he left it all to me. And I wasn't supposed to know. Because my mother, my brother, and my sister were planning to steal it. They weren't just hoping I'd be generous. They were orchestrating a legal maneuver to have the new will thrown out. And they almost succeeded. If I hadn't opened that envelope, I wouldn't have seen it coming. They would have buried the truth, just like they buried him. I remember the day of his funeral. The way my mother cried without tears. The way my brother cracked jokes by the casket. The way my sister kept checking her reflection in the limo window. I stood there holding the folded flag, cold in my hands, and I told myself, this is grief. People express it differently. But now I know better. They weren't mourning. They were calculating. And I was still the fool who brought the pie. My grandfather raised me for the first 6 years of my life. When my mother was too busy finding herself in Tuscany. When my father had already started a second family across town. He taught me how to braid rope, how to balance a checkbook, how to plant bulbs in October so I'd have tulips in spring. He called me Liza Jane. No one else ever has. He used to say, you're the only one who sees the world the way it is, kid. That's your curse and your advantage. I didn't understand what he meant until recently. After I found the will, the real one, in his desk drawer, behind a photo of the two of us on his tractor, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. He knew. He knew they would come for it. And he tried to make it impossible. The document was airtight. Signed, witnessed, and notarized just 2 months before he died. And yet, my mother had the gall to tell me it was a clerical error. She stood in my kitchen, hands clasped over her purse, and said, honey, you know your grandfather wasn't thinking clearly at the end. He meant for it to be shared. I said nothing. She sipped the coffee I made her and added, you'll do the right thing, I know you will. You're not like the rest of us. And she was right. I'm not. But that doesn't mean I'm stupid. Or obedient. Or blind. Later that night, I texted our family lawyer, the only one I trusted. I sent him a photo of the will. Then I asked him the question I had been dreading for days, is this real? And can they still challenge it? His reply came fast. Yes. It's real. And yes, they're already trying. The next morning, I checked the mail and found a certified letter. Filed motion for emergency probate hearing. Request to invalidate most recent testamentary document on grounds of diminished capacity. Filed by Victoria Langley. My mother. I stood in the doorway, letter in hand, and something inside me shifted. I wasn't surprised. But I was no longer afraid either. This wasn't grief. This wasn't confusion. This was war. And I knew exactly how to fight it. My grandfather used to say, blood doesn't entitle anyone to your soul. Only your choices do. I didn't understand it then. Now I live by it. The day after I received the letter, I drove out to the farmhouse. Not because I needed to see the land, or even the house, but because I needed to remember who I was before they started trying to take it from me. It was early. Mist hung low over the hills, and the gravel crackled beneath my tires as I turned onto the familiar path. I parked just behind the barn, where my grandfather used to keep a tin of lemon candies in the glove compartment of his old pickup truck. He said they helped him think. I took one from the stash I kept in my purse and walked the perimeter of the land. That was our ritual. Walk first, talk second. Everything felt quiet. Honest. Nothing like the buzzing, performative air of my mother's home, with its new art pieces every season and the smell of bleach in the guest bathroom. Out here, the silence was full. Every creak in the floorboards, every whine of wind through the barn rafters, was part of something I could trust. This was the first place I ever felt safe. And they wanted to rip it out from under me. The irony wasn't lost on me, how they'd called it our land 4 years, when they never set foot on it unless they needed something. A loan. A tax write-off. A backdrop for family photos to post online. They loved to borrow his legacy. Just not his principles. I stood on the porch with the letter in my pocket and tried to imagine him beside me. He wouldn't have said much. Maybe something like, "You got this, Liza Jane." That was all I needed. I took the original will, his will, and placed it in a fireproof lockbox I had stashed under the kitchen sink. Then I opened the attic and pulled down the rest of the files. Old deeds. Letters. Copies of insurance policies. All the things he'd quietly prepped for a storm he knew would come. He wasn't paranoid. He was precise. My grandfather had worked too hard to leave anything to chance. And he had trusted me with the final move. So I started preparing. Not for a fight. For a siege. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, Ellen Straub. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste adjectives. Practical. Precise. The first time I worked with her, she'd asked me if I wanted a lawyer or a therapist. I told her I needed both. She told me to hire someone else for the second one. I handed her the will and watched her expression shift as she read it. She said, "This changes everything." I replied, "Not for them. They'll still come." She nodded. Then she leaned forward and said something I hadn't expected. She said, "Then let them. They won't win." I wanted to believe that. But belief was a luxury I'd stopped affording myself around the age of 10. Still, something about the way she said it anchored me. Like my grandfather's voice, low, steady, unwavering. We filed the documents the next morning. A formal response to their motion. Attached were copies of the will, signed and notarized, with statements from 2 of his closest friends, both longtime neighbors, confirming his lucidity in the weeks before his death. The first shot was fired. And it wasn't mine. It came from my brother, 2 days later. A voicemail, brittle with false warmth. He said, "Hey, Liza. This whole thing is spiraling way out of control. Mom's really upset. Can't we just meet? Talk like a family?" No mention of what they'd tried to do. No apology. Just guilt, wrapped in the same casual tone he used to ask me for rent money back in college. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the second message. My sister this time. She said, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't how families act. You need to remember where you came from. Where I came from." As if they'd had anything to do with it. They weren't the ones who taught me how to trim apple trees without damaging the bark. Or how to balance a budget on a bad month. Or how to write a resignation letter that burns bridges so cleanly, no smoke is left behind. My grandfather did that. And he did it knowing I'd need those skills not for life, but for survival. They started circling after that. Emails. Messages. My mother even showed up at my office pretending to drop off something for a charity auction. She walked past the receptionist like she owned the place and stood in my doorway with a gift bag and a smile that made my skin crawl. She said, "We're not angry, darling. Just confused." I didn't reply. She added, "This isn't what your grandfather would have wanted." I looked her in the eye for a long time before I answered. I said, "You don't get to speak for him anymore." She blinked, stunned for just a second. Then the mask snapped back into place. She said, "Fine. But don't say we didn't try." And just like that, she turned and left. The gift bag was still on my desk. I didn't open it. I tossed it into the office trash before heading home. The next day, Ellen called. She said, "They've retained corporate counsel. High profile. Aggressive." I asked, "Does it change anything?" She replied, "Only the noise." And there was a lot of it. My brother leaked distorted information to a local paper. Something about estate disputes and estranged family members. My sister started telling mutual friends that I'd manipulated an old man into rewriting his will. Even people I hadn't heard from in years started texting. "Heard what's going on, are you okay? So sorry you're going through this, must be a misunderstanding. Let me know if I can help, but I also talked to your mom, so I'm trying to stay neutral." Neutral. What a beautiful word for cowardice. I stopped responding to all of it. And instead, I started cataloging. Emails. Voicemails. Photos. Copies of every relevant form, date-stamped and backed up on 3 drives. Because it wasn't about the money anymore. Or even the house. It was about not letting them rewrite history. They had stolen enough of that already. And then, just when I thought I was getting used to the quiet brutality of it all, something shifted. Ellen called again. But this time, she didn't start with facts or filings. She said, "You're going to want to sit down." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something new. Not fear. Not hope. But something else. A truth that had been waiting in the shadows, patient and sharp. Waiting to be found. Some truths arrive like thunder. Others slip in quietly, change everything, and leave you sitting in silence with the pieces. Ellen's voice on the phone had been calm, but her words left no room for doubt. She said, "Your grandfather recorded a video." My first instinct wasn't hope. It was dread. Dread that somehow they'd gotten to him. That maybe he'd been pressured into changing things, or that the recording would contradict what I'd found in the will. I asked, "When?" She replied, 3 weeks before he passed. It's notarized. Witnessed. Professionally stored. She paused, and I heard her chair creak. She added, "He addresses everything." I sat at the kitchen table, the one I'd brought with me when I left the farmhouse for grad school. It was scratched, uneven, and had a burn mark from one of his cigars. I ran my fingers over it like a rosary. The flash drive arrived by courier later that day. I waited until dusk before playing it. I don't know why. Maybe because something about that kind of truth needs shadows to live in. When the screen lit up, my breath caught. He was sitting on the porch. My chair beside him, empty. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner. But his eyes were clear. Sharper than ever. He didn't speak immediately. Just looked into the camera for a long moment. Then he began. He said, "If you're watching this, it means things went exactly the way I thought they might." I didn't cry. I just watched. He spoke slowly. Deliberately. About the estate. About my mother. My siblings. About the decisions he made and why. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't rant or moralize. He just told the truth. And he named me. Repeatedly. Directly. He said, "Liza Jane, this is for you." Because you saw me when I was still a man and not just an inheritance. I paused the video and stared at the wall for a long time. I don't remember pressing play again, but at some point, his voice filled the room once more. He explained how he updated the will. How he documented every step. How he left copies with his attorney, his accountant, and one sealed envelope with his closest friend, George, the retired postmaster who had coffee with him every Thursday for 20 years. It was irrefutable. But even more than that, it was personal. It was love. Quiet, complicated, unfinished love. And it changed everything. Ellen filed an emergency motion to have the video entered into the probate record. The court accepted it. My mother's attorney objected, of course. Argued about emotional manipulation and late-stage lucidity. But the judge watched it. Twice. That same week, the pressure started to mutate. Not lessen. Just evolve. Instead of confrontation, they pivoted to performance. My mother began texting again. Casual things. A photo of a mug from my childhood. A blurry image of the backyard swing set, now rusted and half collapsed. She wrote, "Still your home, no matter what." My brother emailed a link to a song we used to listen to in the car on road trips. No subject line. No explanation. My sister sent me a photo of us as kids. At a beach I barely remember. Sandcastles and sunburns and a time before any of us knew how cruel we'd learned to be. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't feel anything. But because I felt too much. They weren't trying to reconnect. They were trying to rewrite history. And in a way, that was more dangerous than the lawyers. Because nostalgia is a weapon when wielded by the dishonest. The next time I saw them was at the preliminary hearing. It was a small courtroom. Beige walls. Fluorescent lights. No drama. Just paperwork and procedure. But the air was charged. My mother wore navy. Pearls. A widow's posture. My brother looked thin, like someone who'd finally realized the money wasn't coming. My sister, she just looked tired. Ellen whispered updates beside me as the judge reviewed the documents, but I wasn't listening. I was watching them. Not with anger. With clarity. This was who they were when no one was left to impress. Afterward, my mother approached me in the hallway. She said, "You're breaking this family." I looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me but never really known me, and I almost said something cruel. But I didn't. I replied, "No. I'm just not lying for you anymore." She blinked, as if that sentence wounded her more than any threat could have. Later that week, I stopped by Ellen's office for a case review. She poured tea into mismatched mugs and asked if I was sleeping. I said, "When I can." "Not well." She didn't press. Instead, she handed me a small folder with printouts. New filings. And something else. She said, "Your mother has a backup plan. A trust fund. One my grandfather had dissolved 2 years before his death, but apparently she'd still been counting on. She had taken out a private loan against it, assuming she'd regain control of the estate and reinstate the assets. It was a house of cards. And now the wind had come. Ellen said, "They're leveraged. All of them. More than you realized." It made sense. The desperation. The sudden charm. The panicked pivot from threats to sentiment. They were drowning. And they thought I was their lifeline. That night, I opened my grandfather's old ledger. The one he used to keep under his bed, wrapped in flannel, full of handwritten notes about every expense, every loan, every dollar that passed through his hands. On the inside cover, he had scribbled something once. A line I never noticed before. Protect what you build. Even from the people you built it for. I read it 10 times. Then I lit a candle, not for ritual, but because I couldn't stand the overhead light anymore. And I started writing. I listed every transaction. Every lie. Every compromise I'd made in the name of peace. Every moment I'd stepped back instead of forward. And then I wrote one more line. Not anymore. The next morning, I called Ellen and gave her permission to proceed with the full countersuit. I wasn't just defending the will now. I was reclaiming the cost of the war they'd started. We filed claims for legal fees, damages, and recovery of funds they'd attempted to extract under false pretenses. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. A long overdue accounting. And just when I thought the ground couldn't shift again, it did. Because Ellen had one more document. One she'd only just received. One I didn't know existed. It wasn't about the land. It wasn't about the will. It was about me. And what my grandfather had left in my name that no one else had discovered. Yet. Some legacies aren't left in wills. They're hidden in quiet corners, behind the noise of expectation and the mess of family. Ellen placed the envelope between us without speaking. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment, and I could see the hesitation in her usually composed expression. That alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. She said, "He started a separate account." Quietly. About 6 years ago. I looked at the envelope. Handwritten. My name in his careful script. It felt heavier than paper should. I asked, "What kind of account?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened a file folder and slid a printed statement across the table. The number at the bottom made my breath catch. $1,450,000. It wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that he had seen the same things I had. That while my mother and siblings were asking for loans and bleeding him dry with emotional blackmail and manufactured emergencies, he had been setting something aside. For me. Every deposit came with a notation in his own words. LJ, after bookstore meeting. LJ, accounting seminar fee refund. LJ, birthday, didn't accept check. Each entry was a moment he tried to give and I politely refused. I felt the sharp sting of tears behind my eyes. Not because I wanted the money. But because I had spent years wondering if he knew. If he saw how hard I tried not to ask for anything. He did. He saw everything. I took the envelope home and opened it in my grandfather's old study, the one with the uneven window that whistled in the wind. Inside were copies of the account statements, a letter written in blue ink, and an old photograph of the two of us in front of his store, me about 10, holding a ledger too big for my arms, smiling like I belonged. I read the letter 3 times. He didn't explain the money. He just told me to use it when the moment comes. That was all. Not if. When. And I understood. This wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. Quiet. Legal. Undeniable. And now it was mine. I started preparing. Not with vengeance, but with precision. I gathered every financial record I could find. Not just from the estate, but from the businesses he used to own, the accounts he sold, the properties he managed before retiring. My grandfather didn't just leave me land. He left a trail of investments and contracts that had been partially buried in shell corporations and obscure trusts. He'd trusted the wrong people to manage parts of it. Or maybe he just didn't want the fight back then. But now, there were clear patterns. Overlap between those names and my mother's associates. Signs that assets had been slowly redirected through pressure and manipulation. The money they were chasing wasn't just about the will. It was about control. Power. Narrative. So I started reclaiming it, piece by piece. I contacted an old accountant he'd worked with, Stan, a man in his 70s who remembered me as the one with the quiet eyes. He opened his files for me. Not because he had to, but because he'd seen what had happened in this family from the sidelines for years. He said, "Henry never trusted easily. But he trusted you." Those were the kind of words you don't forget. I built a map. Not literal, but strategic. A flowchart of every connection, legal, financial, personal, that tied my family to the estate. I highlighted weaknesses. Contracts they'd violated. Undisclosed debts. Forgotten obligations. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. And every step made me stronger. I slept better. Not much. But deeper. The kind of sleep that comes when you stop hoping and start deciding. Ellen helped me draft a final strategy. A formal restructuring proposal that would lock the estate into a non-profit trust in my grandfather's name, focused on community investment, sustainability, and long-term protection of the land. It would remove direct family access. Permanently. We weren't just ending a battle. We were redrawing the entire battlefield. There would be no more last-minute emergency motions. No more public disputes. Once filed, it would be over. Legally. Financially. Symbolically. But it would come at a cost. There would be fallout. And I needed to be ready. So I wrote letters. Not for them. For me. One to my mother. One to my brother. One to my sister. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I just said what was true. What I saw. What I endured. What I no longer would. I burned the drafts in the fireplace after reading them aloud to an empty room. Some words are only meant to be said once. That night, I walked the land again. This time without fear. The sky was clear. The air still. The kind of quiet that used to scare me. Now, it steadied me. And then, just before dawn, Ellen called. She said, "They've called for a meeting." I replied, "Who?" She answered, "All of them. At the house. They want to negotiate." I stood in the kitchen, staring at the window's reflection. Not at myself. But at the woman I had become. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I said, "Then let's give them what they came for. But on my terms." I didn't dress for war. I dressed like myself. Soft gray sweater, black trousers, no jewelry. No pretense. No performance. Just the woman they tried to erase, walking straight into the house she used to tiptoe through. The meeting was set for noon. My mother's idea, though she framed it as neutral territory. The farmhouse, my grandfather's home, was still technically in probate, so no one could object. Except me. I arrived 5 minutes early. On purpose. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the front porch. It was warm for November, but the air still carried the kind of cold that creeps in through your sleeves and settles in your spine. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. They were all there. My mother. My brother. My sister. 2 lawyers I didn't recognize. All of them sitting around the dining table like they hadn't already filed to cut me out of everything. No one stood up. No one smiled. My mother said, "We're glad you came." I took the chair at the head of the table. His chair. No one said a word about that, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. My brother avoided looking at me altogether. My sister just stared, arms crossed, legs bouncing beneath the table. Ellen sat beside me. Calm. Precise. She opened her folder and placed the proposal in front of them. The trust restructure. The final plan. Clean. Legal. Permanent. Ellen said, "This is the offer. Non-negotiable." The lawyers on their side leaned forward. My mother said nothing at first. Just read the document, lips tightening with every paragraph. Then she looked up. She said, "This is theft." I replied, "No. This is the wall you ran into." She blinked, caught off guard by the quietness of my voice. As if she'd expected me to scream. My brother spoke next. Hesitant. Not angry. Just tired. He said, "You really think you're better than us?" I turned toward him. For the first time in a long time, I really looked at him. His skin pale. His shirt wrinkled. That edge of desperation just beneath the sarcasm. I replied, "No. I just think I remember who he was better than you do." Silence. They thought this would be a negotiation. They didn't realize the war was already over. Ellen continued, listing the terms. The estate would become a closed trust, governed by an independent board, 3 members, including myself, but not solely in my control. No direct disbursements to family. All income redirected to community initiatives tied to my grandfather's legacy, youth education, land preservation, small business development. It was airtight. And it was final. My mother's lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity again. Ellen countered with the video. My sister made a snide remark about manipulation. Ellen responded with the signed witness affidavits. My brother asked what would happen if they refused. I answered that one myself. I said, then we proceed to trial. And I opened the full forensic audit on the accounts you all borrowed against. That shut the room down. They didn't speak for a long time after that. Eventually, my mother stood. She didn't look at me. Not directly. She said, "You've changed." I replied, "No. I just stopped apologizing." She left without signing. My brother hesitated. Then followed. My sister lingered, eyes fixed on the floor. She said, "He loved all of us." I replied, "But only one of us loved him back without asking for anything." That landed. She didn't respond. Just picked up her purse and walked out the door. When they were gone, Ellen slid the unsigned documents back into her folder and exhaled. She said, "It's done. On record. We gave them the option. The court will see that." I nodded. But I didn't feel victory. I felt hollow. This wasn't justice. This was what was left when there's nothing left to lose. I stayed at the farmhouse after Ellen left. I walked through each room slowly, running my fingers along the furniture. The photo frames. The chipped molding near the pantry door. It still smelled like him. Wood polish and pipe tobacco and something green, like basil. In the study, I opened the desk drawer and found a small notepad tucked in the back. A single page had been torn out. The imprint still visible. I shaded it with a pencil until the words surfaced. Just 4 words. Eliza knows the truth. No signature. Just his handwriting. His confidence. I placed the pad back exactly where I found it and stood for a long moment in the doorway, unsure if I was ready for what came next. Because the hardest part wasn't holding the line. It was walking away after. And knowing I'd never come back here the same way again. But as I stepped outside, something stopped me. A movement near the barn. I walked toward it. Careful. Slow. And found someone waiting in the shadow. Someone I didn't expect. And everything changed again. Some ghosts were living faces. He stepped out of the barn's shadow like he belonged there, like it hadn't been 15 years since he'd last set foot on this land. Same walk. Same hands shoved into his pockets. Only his hair was thinner now, and his eyes carried a guilt that didn't exist the last time I saw him. Uncle Rob. My grandfather's youngest brother. The one we never talked about. He left when I was 18. Disappeared after an argument I wasn't supposed to hear. Something about money. About loyalty. About who Henry trusted and who he didn't. I stood frozen for a second. Then I stepped closer. He looked at me with the sort of sadness that doesn't beg for forgiveness, it just asks to be allowed to speak. He said, "Didn't mean to spook you. Ellen told me you'd be here." I didn't reply. He rubbed the back of his neck, same nervous gesture he used to do when he was fixing the fence and trying to explain the difference between hardwood and softwood. He added, "I heard what you did. About the trust. About the court. Still, I said nothing. Because something in me didn't trust what I wanted to feel, relief. He held out a folded piece of paper. He said, "Your grandfather asked me to hold on to this. In case the others tried to undo what he built." The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Not from cold. From weight. I took it. And for a moment, everything felt still. It wasn't long. Just a paragraph, handwritten. A dated statement, signed by Henry and witnessed by Rob. Explicit confirmation of intent for the trust, and a final line that felt like closure stitched into ink. "Eliza carries the heart of this family. The rest only carry its name." I folded the page and slipped it into my coat. Then I looked at Rob. Really looked. He wasn't asking for anything. Not redemption. Not re-entry. Just acknowledgement. And maybe that was enough. I said, "I'm glad you kept it." He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the road, boots crunching in the dirt. I watched until he disappeared behind the trees. And that's when it began. The calls. The emails. The inevitable unraveling. The probate judge signed off on the trust restructure. The video, the affidavit, the ledger, all admitted into record. My family had no legal ground left to stand on. The court closed the case within 6 weeks. They didn't appeal. Because by then, the fallout had already begun. My mother's loan defaulted. The lender seized one of her properties. Not the main house, yet, but the vacation one she always used to brag about, the one with the view she never invited me to see. My brother's consulting business, built mostly on borrowed favors and misused family ties, quietly dissolved after several unfortunate misunderstandings with clients. The kind of misunderstandings that happen when your name stops opening doors. My sister's marriage cracked under the strain. I don't know the full story, only that I received a brief, clipped email from her saying she was re-evaluating priorities. I didn't respond. Because this wasn't a time for explanations. It was a time for letting things fall where they would. I visited the farmhouse weekly. Managed the trust board meetings. Filed for the land easement protections. Approved funding for the new community greenhouse in Henry's name. It felt good to build something. Something that didn't revolve around pain. I wasn't naive. I knew they'd resurface. People like them don't vanish. They circle back when the wind changes. But for now, they were quiet. And I learned to live in the quiet without bracing for the storm. I changed the locks on the farmhouse. Updated the security. Not out of fear. But because it was mine now. And ownership meant responsibility. I kept the door open for community visits, for nonprofit events, for the kids' gardening programs we'd started through the trust. I even hosted a workshop for small-scale sustainable farming one weekend, just like Henry used to dream about. People came. Real people. Strangers who became allies. There was one woman, Teresa, whose son reminded me so much of myself it made my chest ache. Quiet, focused, always a little off to the side. She told me he used to hate the dirt, but now he wouldn't leave the greenhouse. She said, "I don't know what you did here, but it matters." I didn't have words for that. Just a nod. Because that's what healing sounds like sometimes. Not grand speeches. Just silence that feels full instead of hollow. Ellen called me one night, just after the trust's first quarterly report went public. She said, "You know what's funny?" I replied, "What?" She said, "You've built something they'll spend the rest of their lives pretending didn't hurt." I didn't laugh. But I did sleep better that night. I still get the occasional message from someone in the family orbit. Distant cousins. Old acquaintances. People who've just wanted to check in. I don't answer. Not because I hold a grudge. But because the door to my peace has only one key. And I'm not handing it out. I kept my grandfather's ledger on my nightstand now. Not for money. For memory. For every line he wrote that didn't have a dollar sign, just a thought. A reminder. A truth. One entry near the back caught my eye the other day. LJ stood her ground today. Said no when it was easier to say nothing. Proud of her. It was dated 3 years before he died. And I never knew he noticed. But he did. He always did. And now, I was starting to believe I'd never really been alone. Because legacy doesn't live in land. It lives in the choices we protect. The ones we pass on. And just when I thought the final page had been turned, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A letter. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother. Some letters don't ask to be read. They demand to be witnessed. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Tight, slanted, practiced. The kind of script that looked like it came from a Catholic school desk and years of writing thank you cards she never meant. Just seeing it on the envelope was enough to send that familiar weight down my spine. But I opened it. Of course I did. The letter was short. No greeting. No apology. Just an arrangement of words that barely masked their real purpose. You win. I hope it was worth it. That was the first line. And for a moment, I almost felt the sting she wanted me to. Almost. But then I looked past the venom, past the theatrics, and saw what was really there. Resentment, yes. But underneath that, fear. Of being irrelevant. Of no longer holding the story. She didn't mention the trust, the land, or the court case. She didn't ask for reconciliation. She didn't even say goodbye. She just signed her name. Victoria. Not mom. Not even mother. Just the woman she was before I learned to see her clearly. I folded the letter and placed it in the same fireproof box where I'd kept the will. Not as evidence. Just as a bookmark. A record of the final move in a game I never agreed to play. I didn't reply. Silence was the only answer that felt honest. Weeks passed. The land began to change again. Late winter softened the ground, and the greenhouse filled with steam and saplings. We held a winter market in the barn. Tables covered in quilts and preserves. The kind of event my grandfather would have walked through slowly, greeting every person by name. It was the first time in years that the property felt alive. Not haunted by history, not pinned under the weight of memory, but full of breath. Movement. A local journalist asked if I'd be willing to speak for a piece on rural restoration. She'd heard about the trust, the lawsuits, the turnaround. She wanted to frame it as a story of resilience. I said no. Not because I didn't care. But because I knew the story didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to every child who planted a seed in that soil. Every person who walked through the barn and saw something worth building. Every quiet survivor who found a place to exhale. The real legacy wasn't the property. It was the permission to begin again. Some days, I still walk the fields alone. Just like we used to. No noise. No music. Just wind and birds and the crunch of boots on frozen grass. I talk to him sometimes. Not in the way that asks for answers. Just in the way that says, I heard you. I'm still listening. One morning, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A carving in the old cedar near the back fence. Weathered and almost hidden by moss. Just 3 initials and a year. HL 1984. It was his. Probably carved before I was born. A marker of presence. Of intent. It made me smile. Because that's what we all want in the end, isn't it? To leave something behind that says, we were here. That we mattered. That we tried. I no longer needed their recognition. Or their approval. They could forget me. Rewrite me. Omit me from every future story they told at dinner parties and holiday brunches. But this land would remember. The kids who now ran laughing through the fields would remember. The vegetables that grew where bitterness once festered would remember. And I, quiet, stubborn, watchful Eliza Jane, would remember. Not the pain. Not the betrayal. But the fact that I chose something else. That I walked into the fire and didn't become it. I don't know where my mother is now. Or what version of the story she's telling herself to sleep at night. I hope she finds peace. Not because she deserves it. But because I do. The kind of peace that doesn't hinge on someone else's apology. The kind that grows in silence, in soil, in solitude. In knowing that I saved the one thing worth saving. Myself. So when people ask me what happened, why the land is still here, why the trust worked, why it didn't end in bitterness or fire or erasure, I tell them the truth. I chose to remember love louder than loss. And that changed everything.